There is a moment that almost every person who has ever loved a narcissist can describe with uncomfortable precision. It is not the moment the abuse started. It is not the first time they lied to your face, or the first time they made you feel like the problem, or even the first time you caught yourself apologizing for something you didn't do. The moment I'm talking about comes later. It comes after months, sometimes years of trying, after you have explained yourself until your voice gave out, after you have cried in front of them hoping that just once your tears would land somewhere real, after you have rearranged your personality, your schedule, your dreams, and your sense of self around the task of managing one person's ego. The moment comes quietly. You're standing in a room or sitting in your car or lying in the dark at 3 a.m, and something shifts. Not dramatically, not with music or revelation, just a small, exhausted, almost imperceptible shift, and a thought surfaces that you can't push back down. What if none of this was ever going to work? What if I have been trying to fill a hole that has no bottom? That thought is the beginning of everything we are going to talk about today, because that thought, as painful as it is the first honest thing your mind has allowed itself to think in a very long time. And the reason you suppressed it for so long, the reason most people do, is not weakness. It is not stupidity. It is not some flaw in your character that made you susceptible. The reason you kept trying is because you are human, and humans are wired at a biological level to keep reaching for connection, to keep attempting repair, to keep believing that if they just find the right words, the right moment, the right version of themselves, the person they love will finally show up for them. That instinct is not pathological. In a healthy relationship, it is exactly what sustains love over time. The tragedy of a narcissistic relationship is that the same instinct that would have built something beautiful in a different context becomes, in this one, the mechanism of your own destruction. So let's start with the question that everything else depends on. What is a narcissist actually doing when they engage with you? Because most people, even people who have done significant reading on this topic, still carry a fundamental misunderstanding about what is happening beneath the surface of these interactions. They believe on some level that the narcissist is trying to connect, that the cruelty, the manipulation, the gaslighting, even the rage are all distorted expressions of something that is at its root relational, a broken attempt at love. And that belief, more than anything else, is what keeps people locked inside the dynamic long after every other part of them is begging to leave. Here is the truth that the research gives us and that trauma therapists and psychoanalysts have understood for decades, but that rarely gets said plainly enough. A narcissist is not trying to connect with you. They are extracting from you. There is a concept in clinical psychology called narcissistic supply, first introduced by the Austrian psychoanalyst Otto von Ischl, and later developed extensively by object relations theorists. And it describes something that should change the way you understand every interaction you have ever had with this person. Narcissistic supply is the emotional sustenance a narcissist draws from other people. And unlike the sustenance that flows between two people in a genuinely mutual relationship, this is entirely one-directional. It does not nourish you in return. It does not even see you. It simply takes what most people discover with a jolt of recognition when they first encounter this concept, is that the supply does not require positive emotion from you. Your admiration feeds a narcissist, but so does your distress. Your praise is supply, and so is your confusion, your pleading, your anger, your silence that they successfully broke, your tears that confirm their power over you. The content of your emotional response is almost irrelevant to them. What matters is the response itself. What matters is that you are still there, still reacting, still oriented toward them. What matters is that you are still their mirror. because that is what you have always been in this dynamic. Not a partner, not even a person, in the full sense of the word. A mirror that confirms their existence. This is where I need you to stay with me, because this is the part that most people hear intellectually but do not yet feel in their body. At the core of narcissistic personality structure, beneath the confidence, beneath the arrogance, beneath the charm that probably drew you in and the cruelty that has kept you off balance ever since, there is an emptiness, not a dramatic emptiness, not something they are visibly suffering from, but a structural one, a self that was never fully formed, because the conditions required for genuine self-development, unconditional attunement, being loved, not for performance, but for existence, were not reliably present in the earliest chapters of their life. The psyche, in its extraordinary resourcefulness, built a replacement, a constructed self, a persona of superiority and dominance, designed to extract externally what was never provided internally. That constructed self has no roots. It has no stable foundation. It is held together entirely by the reflections of people like you, which means that when you stop reflecting, when you withdraw your attention, your reaction, your emotional energy from someone whose entire psychological architecture depends on those things to feel real, you do not simply inconvenience them. You do not merely annoy them or inspire their contempt. You destabilize them at the deepest level available. You become, in the most precise clinical sense of the word, their worst nightmare. Not because you've done anything aggressive, not because you have mounted a campaign or told their secrets or delivered the devastating speech you have been composing in your head for months, but because you have done something their entire system has no defense against. You have simply stopped. And that is what we are going to talk about today, what it actually means to treat a narcissist as though they are dead, why it works at a psychological level that goes far deeper than strategy or revenge, what happens when you do it, what they do in response, and exactly how to hold your ground through it. And most importantly, what begins to happen inside you in the silence that follows when you finally stop feeding what has been feeding on you. There is a phrase that tends to make people uncomfortable the first time they hear it. Treat them like they are dead. And I understand that discomfort. I want to sit with it for a moment before we move past it, because the discomfort itself is worth examining. When most people hear that instruction, their first reaction is resistance. It feels cold. It feels unkind. It feels like the kind of thing a bitter, hardened person would do, someone who has closed themselves off from empathy, someone who has let their wounds turn them into something they don't want to be. And underneath that resistance, if you are honest with yourself, there is probably something else. A fear that if you truly stop engaging, truly stop responding, truly withdraw every last thread of emotional investment from this person, you will have confirmed their narrative about you, that we're always the cold one, the distant one, the one who never really cared. I want you to notice that thought. I want you to hold it up to the light for just a moment, because it is one of the most sophisticated traps in the entire architecture of narcissistic abuse. The idea that your continued engagement is evidence of your warmth and your disengagement is evidence of your cruelty was not something you arrived at on your own. It was installed. It was placed inside you carefully and repeatedly by someone who understood, whether consciously or not, that as long as you believed your decency required your participation, they would never lose access to you. Your goodness was turned into a leash. And every time you almost left, almost stopped responding, almost let the silence stretch long enough to mean something, that belief pulled you back, because you did not want to be the cold one. You did not want to be the one who gave up. You did not want to become someone who treats another human being as though they do not exist. Here is what I want you to understand. Treating a narcissist like they are dead is not a statement about their humanity. It is a statement about your survival. It is not something you do to them. It is something you do for yourself. And it is not coldness. It is the most radical, most deliberate, most psychologically sophisticated act of self-preservation available to you. Let me show you the difference, because it matters enormously. Coldness is reactive. It is the emotional shutdown that happens when a person has been hurt so many times that they stop allowing themselves to feel. Coldness is armor. Coldness is still about them because it is a response to them, a shape you have taken in reaction to what they did to you. What we are talking about is something entirely different. What we are talking about is neutrality, not the performance of neutrality, not the gritted teeth, white-knuckled pretense of not caring while you are quietly screaming inside. Genuine, settled, internally sourced neutrality that comes not from shutting down your emotions, but from redirecting them away from someone who has demonstrated repeatedly and conclusively that they will only use your emotions against you. Think about how you actually relate to someone who has genuinely passed away, not someone you are grieving in the acute, raw, early stages of loss, but someone whose death you have had time to integrate. Someone who is simply no longer part of the living architecture of your daily life. You do not argue with them in your head. You do not rehearse conversations hoping they will finally understand you. You do not brace for their moods or reshape yourself to manage their reactions or lie awake wondering what they meant by that comment 3 weeks ago. They are gone. And in their absence, something that was always beneath the noise of managing them begins to quietly resurface. You begin slowly and sometimes disorientally to hear yourself again. That is the energy we are talking about, that quality of release. That particular freedom that comes not from winning, not from getting the apology or the acknowledgement or the admission you always deserved, but from simply no longer needing it, from having transferred your attention, your energy, your emotional investment away from someone who is consuming all of it and back toward your own life, toward your own thoughts, toward your own thoughts, toward your own wants, which you may have almost forgotten how to access. This is not a performance you put on for their benefit. It is not a strategy designed to make them miss you or regret what they did or finally understand what they lost. In fact, if you are doing it with any of those intentions still active, you are not quite there yet, and that is okay. This is a process. But the destination is a place where their reaction to your silence is genuinely, completely no longer the point. Now, let's talk about what this actually looks like in practice. Because one of the most common things people say when they first encounter the concept of going no contact, of withdrawing supply, of treating the narcissist though they are dead, is that it sounds right in theory, but they have no idea how to actually do it. Their mind keeps returning to the person. They find themselves composing responses to arguments that haven't even happened yet. They check the narcissist's social media, not because they want to, but because something in them, something that feels almost compulsive, keeps pulling them back. They draft messages they never send. They rehearse the perfect final statement that will make everything make sense. And then they feel ashamed of all of this, as though the fact that they cannot simply switch off their investment proves something is wrong with them. Nothing is wrong with you. What you are experiencing is not weakness or dysfunction. It is the predictable neurological consequence of a very specific kind of psychological conditioning that we are going to unpack in detail later in this video. For now, what I want you to hold on to is this. The goal is not to feel nothing. The goal is to feel it all. Every bit of the grief and the anger and the confusion and the loss, and to feel it somewhere the narcissist cannot reach, inside yourself, in therapy, with people who are safe, not in front of them, and not in response to them. Because the moment your emotion becomes visible to them, the moment they can see that they still have the ability to generate a reaction in you, it becomes supply. Even your pain becomes something they are fed by. The silence is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision about where your feelings belong. So we have established what narcissistic supply is, and we have established what it means to withdraw it. But I want to go somewhere deeper now, because there is a question sitting underneath everything we have covered so far. And if I do not answer it directly, everything else will feel like instruction without understanding. The question is this: why does it work? Why does your silence specifically land with such devastating force on someone who spent the entire relationship performing invincibility? Why does a person who made you feel invisible, irrelevant, and disposable suddenly become destabilized the moment you treat them the way they always claim to see you? Why does indifference, of all things, become the one weapon that their entire arsenal has no answer for? The answer is not satisfying in the way that revenge fantasies are satisfying. It does not involve them suffering visibly in a way you get to witness. But it is far more profound than revenge. And understanding it fully will do something that revenge never could. It will permanently change the way you see them. When you see them clearly, really clearly, without the distortion of hope or fear or the need to make their behavior mean something about your worth, the whole dissolves. Not all at once, but it begins. Let's go back to the beginning of the narcissistic personality itself, because this is where the answer lives. Narcissism at its clinical root is not arrogance. It is not selfishness in the ordinary sense of the word. It is a survival adaptation. It is what the human psyche constructs when a child, in their most formative and vulnerable years, does not receive what every child fundamentally requires to develop a stable, integrated sense of self. What they require is unconditional attunement, being loved not for their performance, not for how they make a parent feel, not for their achievements or their compliance or their ability to manage an adult's emotional needs, but simply for their existence. When that attunement is absent, when love is conditional or unpredictable, when the child's authentic emotional experience is consistently ignored, minimized, or punished, the developing psyche makes an extraordinarily intelligent decision. It buries the authentic self, the one that was too much or not enough, the one that kept getting rejected, and it constructs an alternative, a performing self, a grandiose, armored, carefully managed persona built entirely around extracting the external validation that was never reliably provided from the inside. This is what we are dealing with when we talk about a narcissist, not a powerful person, not a confident person, a performed person, a person whose entire sense of reality, whose entire experience of existing as a coherent human being is dependent on the continuous input of other people's reactions. Without that input, the constructed self has nothing to stand on. It does not have an inner world to retreat to. It does not have a stable sense of identity that persists when no one is watching. It has only the mirror. And when the mirror goes blank, when you stop reflecting, stop reacting the emotional data that tells them they are real and relevant and in control, the structure does not simply feel inconvenienced, it feels existentially threatened. Psychoanalysts call this a narcissistic injury. And the response to narcissistic injury, which clinicians call narcissistic rage, is not the anger of someone who is powerful. It is the terror of someone whose psychological survival feels suddenly, viscerally at stake. This is what I want you to carry with you, because it will protect you when things get harder, which they often do before they get easier. The rage is not evidence of your wrongdoing. The escalation is not proof that you have been too cold, too harsh, too unforgiving. It is a diagnostic signal. It is the most honest thing a narcissist will ever show you, because it reveals with complete clarity exactly how much of their stability was built on your compliance. Every text they send after you go silent, every sudden reappearance dressed in warmth and nostalgia, every whisper campaign, every attempt to reach you through mutual friends, every escalating provocation designed to force any reaction, even anger, even disgust, because even your anger confirms that they still exist in your emotional world. All of it is the sound of a structure collapsing that was only ever held up by you. Here's something I need to say carefully, because it is a place where a lot of people get pulled back in. When a narcissist begins to lose their grip on you, one of the first things they deploy is not rage. Rage comes later. What comes first is tenderness. It is the sudden, almost uncanny reappearance of the person you first fell in love with. The warmth you spent the whole relationship chasing, the attentiveness you kept trying to earn, the gentleness you saw glimpses of in the beginning and held on to as proof of who they really were. It surfaces right when you have created meaningful distance, right when you have almost convinced yourself that leaving was right, and for a nervous system that has been trained over months or years to associate this person with both the deepest wound and the only available relief, the pull of that tenderness is almost unbearable. This is called hoovering, named after the vacuum, because it is designed to suck you back in. And the cruelty of it is not just in the manipulation itself, but in how precisely it is targeted. They are not performing a generic version of kindness. They are performing the specific version of themselves that you told them through years of hope and reaction and tearful conversations that you were still holding out for. Every time you explained what you needed, you gave them the blueprint. Every time you described what the relationship could be if they would just try, you handed them the script for exactly this moment. They are not transformed. They are tactical. And the version of them standing in front of you right now, soft and remorseful, and finally saying everything you always needed to hear, is not a person who has changed. It is a system in panic, reaching for the one power source it knows how to activate. When you understand this, really understand it at the level where it stops being information and starts being perception, something shifts in how you experience these moments. The tenderness stops feeling like a door and starts feeling like a trap door. You can see it for what it is without needing to harden yourself against it, without needing to hate them, to resist it. You simply see it clearly. And clarity, as we said at the beginning, is where freedom lives, not the freedom of someone who has stopped feeling, the freedom of someone who finally sees without the distortion of hope that was always costing them more than they could afford to keep spending. That is the freedom that silence builds. That is what becomes available in the space where your reaction used to be. And it is worth every uncomfortable moment of learning to hold it. There is a stage that nobody warns you about adequately. You have done the reading. You understand the psychology. You have accepted, at least intellectually, that what you experienced was not a relationship in any mutual sense of the word, but an extraction. You have started to pull back. You have let some silences stretch. You have stopped explaining yourself, stopped initiating, stopped performing the emotional labor of managing someone who is never going to acknowledge the cost of it. And something has begun to shift. Small things at first. You sleep a little better. You notice a thought that belongs entirely to you, not filtered through the question of how they would react to it. You catch yourself making a decision, a small, ordinary daily decision, without first consulting their imagined response. These moments are quiet. They do not feel like victory. They feel more like remembering, like the faint return of a frequency you had forgotten you are capable of receiving. Then, without warning, the grief arrives. Not grief for them necessarily, though. That is real too, and we will get to it. But a deeper grief, a grief for the years for the version of yourself that spent so long contorting, shrinking, performing, and explaining, for the mornings you woke up already anxious, for the relationships with other people that quietly eroded while all your emotional bandwidth was consumed by one person's instability, for the dreams you put on hold, the opportunities you didn't take, the parts of yourself you edited out because they made the narcissist uncomfortable or competitive or contemptuous. This grief is not a sign that you are going backward. It is a sign that you are finally present enough to feel what was always true. You are not falling apart. You are thawing. I want to talk about identity because this is the dimension of narcissistic abuse that receives the least attention and causes some of the most lasting damage. We talk extensively about the trauma. We talk about the gaslighting, the manipulation, the erosion of trust, the hypervigilance that follows you into rooms where you are completely safe. All of that is real, and all of it deserves the conversation it is getting. But what we do not talk about enough is the specific systematic way that prolonged exposure to a narcissist dismantles a person's sense of self, not through one dramatic act, through 1,000 small ones. A comment here, a dismissal there, a raised eyebrow at your excitement, a subtle reframing of your memory until you stop trusting your own recollection of events, a pattern of responses to your authentic self that teach you without a single explicit statement that who you actually are is either too much or not enough, and that the version of you worth keeping is the one that makes them comfortable. Psychologists call this identity erosion, and what makes it so insidious is that it does not feel like violence while it is happening. It feels like growth. It feels like maturity. It feels like love because you were told implicitly or explicitly that containing yourself, adjusting yourself, softening your edges and muting your frequency was what intimacy required. That to be loved, you had to be manageable. And so you became manageable. Most survivors did, not because they were weak, but because the need for connection is so fundamental, so biologically wired into the human system, that we will reshape ourselves to extraordinary degrees before we will accept that the connection we are fighting for was never safe enough to be worth the reshaping. Here is what begins to happen when you stop, when you genuinely, consistently, from a place of growing internal clarity rather than performed indifference, withdraw your energy from the narcissist and begin returning it to yourself. The first thing you notice is the noise, not external noise, internal noise, the constant background hum of monitoring, anticipating, bracing, calculating, that you had become so accustomed to that you stopped registering it as anything other than normal consciousness. When it begins to quiet, it is disorienting before it is peaceful. You may not know what to do with the mental space. You may find yourself reaching. G for the anxiety, the way you would reach for a phone that is no longer in your pocket. The absence of hypervigilance can feel paradoxically like something is wrong because your nervous system learned to read calm as the moment before the explosion, and it does not yet know how to trust stillness. This is normal. This is not a sign that you cannot heal or that the damage is permanent. It is a sign that your nervous system is doing exactly what nervous systems do. It is operating from the map it was given, and the work of recovery, the real work, the work that happens not in the moments of dramatic resolve, but in the quiet, ordinary dailiness of choosing differently, is the slow, patient process of drawing a new map, of accumulating enough experiences of safety, of calm that does not collapse, of stillness that does not precede violence, that your body begins to update its predictions. That is not a fast process. It cannot be rushed or hacked or bypassed. But it is happening even when you cannot feel it happening. And every single day that you do not return to the dynamic is a day that rewrites something in the architecture of your nervous system. Now I want to address something directly because I know it is sitting in the room. The question of whether any of this means you have to stop loving them, whether choosing yourself requires you to harden yourself against the genuine feeling you had, the real tenderness, the actual hope, all of it real, even inside something that was harmful. I want to tell you that you do not have to stop loving them to leave them. You do not have to turn them into a monster in your mind to justify protecting yourself. The most mature, most honest, most genuinely healed version of this looks like holding both things at once, that the feeling was real and that the relationship was not safe, that you can wish them well from an enormous distance, that you can grieve what you wanted it to be without returning to what it actually was. That love, real love, including the love you have for yourself, is sometimes most honestly expressed not by staying, but by finally, quietly, without announcement or drama or the perfect final word, simply walking away and not looking back. This is what it means to treat them like they are dead, not hatred, not performance, not a strategy for winning something, a private, settled, internally sovereign decision that this person no longer occupies emotional real estate in the only life you have been given. You are not doing it to become their worst nightmare, though you will. You are doing it because somewhere underneath everything they told you to be, the person you actually are has been waiting with extraordinary patience for you to finally come home. And that person, the one who existed before the relationship rewrote them, the one with opinions they did not censor and desires they did not suppress, and a frequency that did not need to be muted to make someone else feel powerful, that person was never lost. They were only quiet. And in the silence that follows your withdrawal, in the space where their chaos used to live, you will begin, slowly and then all at once, to hear them again. That is not their worst nightmare. That is your best beginning.
What most people never realize is that the habit of taking responsibility for other people's emotions doesn't begin as weakness, it begins as intelligence. At some point in your life, probably early, you learned that harmony equals safety. You learned that if you could read emotional shifts quickly, if you could anticipate disappointment, anger, or sadness before it fully surfaced, you could prevent chaos. You became the emotional regulator in the room, not because anyone officially appointed you, but because you were capable. And capability, when paired with a lack of boundaries, quietly turns into obligation. Psychologically, this is where things start to go wrong. When you consistently step in to manage how others feel, your nervous system starts to believe that other people's emotional states are your responsibility. Their disappointment feels like your failure. Their anger feels like your mistake. Their sadness feels like something you should have prevented. Over time, this creates a distorted sense of control. You feel responsible, but you're not actually in control. And that imbalance is exhausting. You're carrying weight you were never meant to carry while lacking the authority. To change the behavior that keeps creating the weight in the first place. This is why you hesitate before speaking. You don't ask, is this true first? You ask, how will this make them feel? You edit yourself in real time. You dilute clarity to preserve comfort. You delay honesty because you imagine emotional fallout. And on the surface, this looks like emotional maturity. But philosophically, it's a subtle form of self-betrayal. You're prioritizing emotional outcomes over personal alignment. You're choosing short-term peace over long-term integrity. The deeper issue is identity erosion. When you repeatedly suppress your own perspective to accommodate others, you start losing track of what you actually think and feel. Your inner compass becomes calibrated to external reaction instead of internal values. You stop trusting your own instincts because you've trained yourself to override them. Over time, This creates a quiet internal resentment, not just toward others, but toward yourself, because somewhere inside, you know you're not being honest. And humans can forgive many things, but sustained self-deception always extracts a price. From a psychological standpoint, this pattern reinforces learned helplessness. You feel responsible for outcomes you cannot fully control, so you try harder, give more, and manage better. When it doesn't work, you blame yourself. You tell yourself you didn't communicate gently enough, empathize deeply enough, or sacrifice sufficiently. The standard keeps rising, but the return keeps shrinking. This is how capable, empathetic people slowly train themselves into emotional burnout while calling it kindness. There's also a philosophical trap here. You confuse morality with self-denial. You believe being a good person means minimizing the discomfort of others, even when that discomfort is the natural consequence of truth. But truth is not violence. Discomfort is not harm. Growth has never occurred without friction. By shielding people from emotional discomfort, you may feel compassionate, but you're also interfering with their development. And by constantly absorbing that discomfort yourself, you stunt your own. This is where the fear of hurting others becomes dangerous. Not because hurting others is good, but because fearing it absolutely gives other people inherent power over your behavior. Anyone who reacts strongly now controls you. Anyone who withholds approval now directs you. You become emotionally governed by the most sensitive person in the room. And that is not empathy. That is emotional tyranny, even if it's unintentional. When you take responsibility for emotions that are not yours, you also distort relationships. People stop meeting you as an equal and start relating to you as a regulator. You become the buffer, the mediator, the one who smooths things over. And while this role feels meaningful, it often comes with an unspoken rule. Your needs are secondary. Not because people are malicious, but because you taught them that. Humans adapt to the emotional rules of engagement presented to them. If you consistently deprioritize yourself, others will follow your lead. The real tragedy is that this pattern blocks authentic connection. True intimacy requires risk. It requires honesty that might disappoint, challenge, or unsettle the other person. When you constantly filter yourself to avoid emotional impact, people never meet the real you. They meet a curated version designed for emotional safety. And while that version may be liked, it is rarely respected. Respect emerges when someone is grounded enough to be real, not endlessly accommodating. At a deeper level, this behavior reflects a misunderstanding of responsibility itself. You are responsible for your intentions, your actions, and your integrity. You are not responsible for how others process reality. Each person owns their emotional interpretation of events. When you take ownership of that process for them, you rob them of agency and yourself of authenticity. That's not compassion, that's control disguised as care. The shift begins when you redefine responsibility. Responsibility is not preventing emotional discomfort at all costs. Responsibility is showing up truthfully, cleanly, and without malice. It's speaking with respect, not self-erasure. It's allowing others to feel what they feel without rushing in to fix it. This doesn't make you cold. It makes you psychologically grounded. As you stop absorbing what isn't yours, something remarkable happens. Your energy returns. Your words gain weight. Your presence stabilizes. You no longer need to explain yourself excessively because you're no longer asking for permission to exist honestly. And paradoxically, this often leads to healthier relationships. The people who can meet you at this level stay. The ones who relied on your overfunctioning drift away. That's not loss, that's alignment. The fear of hurting others fades when you realize that betraying yourself is the deepest harm you can commit. And the moment you stop carrying emotional weight that was never yours, you don't become selfish, you become whole. One of the most misunderstood strengths an empath possesses is hyper-awareness. This ability to read a room, to sense emotional undercurrents before a word is spoken, to detect shifts in tone, posture, and energy is not accidental. It's a finely tuned psychological skill. You didn't wake up one day with it. You developed it through observation, pattern recognition, and survival. At some point, being aware kept you safe. It allowed you to adapt quickly, avoid unnecessary conflict, and navigate complex emotional environments. And for a long time, it worked. But what begins as a survival advantage can quietly become a prison when it operates without boundaries. You are constantly scanning. Not consciously, but instinctively. You walk into a conversation already tracking reactions. You adjust your words mid-sentence. You soften your delivery before anyone asks you to. You notice when someone's energy dips, when impatience creeps in, when interest fades. Most people are oblivious to these signals. You are not. And because you are not, you assume responsibility for them. You think, I should change my tone, I should stop talking, I should explain myself better, I should make this easier for them. That constant adjustment feels like intelligence, but over time it becomes self-erasure. Psychologically, this creates a state of chronic vigilance. Your nervous system never fully relaxes because it is always monitoring external emotional data. This is not presence. This is hyperarousal. Your mind is always on, always calculating outcomes, always predicting reactions. While others are simply expressing themselves, you are performing emotional calculus, and that costs energy, massive energy. The problem isn't awareness itself. Awareness is neutral. The problem is the belief that awareness requires action. You assume that because you notice something, you must manage it. Because you sense discomfort, you must reduce it. Because you detect tension, you must dissolve it. But awareness does not equal obligation. See, everything does not mean fixing everything. And when you confuse the two, you turn a gift into a burden. This is where exhaustion sets in. Not physical exhaustion, but a deep mental fatigue, decision fatigue. Emotional fatigue. You are tired, not because you do too much physically, but because you are always regulating, always holding space, always compensating. You carry the emotional inefficiencies of everyone around you. And no one sees it because it happens internally. From the outside, you look calm, composed, capable. Inside, you are running a marathon that never ends. Philosophically, this is the danger of over-identification with perception. You start to believe that your role is to be the stabilizer of environments rather than a participant in them. You stop experiencing life and start managing it. And when life becomes a management task instead of an experience, joy fades. Curiosity fades, spontaneity fades. Everything becomes strategic, safe, controlled, and deeply unsatisfying. There's also a hidden power dynamic here that most empaths don't recognize. The most emotionally reactive person in the room begins to set the rules. Because you are so aware, you adapt to them. You lower your volume for the sensitive one. You walk on eggshells around the volatile one. You minimize yourself around the insecure one. Slowly, unconsciously, you are being trained, not through force, but through reaction. And the more you adapt, the more power external emotional states have over you. This is not emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence includes self-regulation, not just social awareness. If you can read everyone else but cannot stay grounded in yourself, your intelligence is incomplete. Awareness without self-command is just exposure. It leaves you open, permeable, and drained. At a deeper psychological level, constant hyper-awareness can disconnect you from your own body. You live in your head, analyzing signals instead of inhabiting your physical experience. You second-guess your instincts because you're too busy interpreting everyone else's. You feel tension, but ignore it. You feel irritation, but override it. You feel the impulse to speak, but suppress it. Over time, your body learns that its signals are less important than external harmony. And that's when anxiety creeps in. Not because something is wrong, but because you've trained yourself to ignore your own internal alarms. The solution is not to shut down awareness. That's impossible and unnecessary. The solution is to introduce boundaries at the level of attention. You don't need to track everything. You don't need to respond to everything you sense. You don't need to optimize every emotional interaction. Sometimes the most powerful move is to stay still internally while emotions move around you, to observe without absorbing, to notice without adjusting. This requires a shift in identity. You are not the emotional thermostat of the room. You are a participant with your own temperature. When you allow yourself to remain steady instead of constantly adjusting, something surprising happens. Others begin to regulate themselves, not because you told them to, but because grounded presence is contagious. Calm authority doesn't chase harmony, it embodies it. When you stop over-managing emotional space, your words become more direct, your timing improves, your presence deepens. You are no longer reacting to subtle shifts, you are responding from clarity. And clarity carries weight. People listen differently when you're not negotiating your own existence. This is also weight. Confidence begins to grow, not performative confidence, but internal confidence. The kind that comes from trusting yourself more than the room. From knowing that you can tolerate discomfort, including others. From understanding that not every reaction requires correction. This doesn't make you insensitive, it makes you resilient. Hyper-awareness becomes a strength again when it serves you, not when it enslaves you. When you choose when to engage it and when to let it rest. When you remember that awareness is information, not a command. And once you reclaim that choice, exhaustion gives way to presence, and presence becomes power. When you stop living as a constant emotional antenna and start standing as a grounded signal of your own, the noise loses its control over you, and you finally hear yourself clearly again. There's a point where generosity stops being virtuous and starts becoming destructive, and most empaths cross that line without ever realizing it. Self-sacrifice feels natural to you. It feels like love. It feels like loyalty. It feels like strength. You tell yourself that enduring emotional discomfort proves your depth, your patience, your maturity. And in the beginning, it even earns you admiration. People see you as dependable, understanding, unshakable. But what they don't see is the internal cost of constantly putting yourself last. And what you may not want to admit is that the cost compounds over time. Psychologically, self-sacrifice activates a dangerous loop. Each time you ignore your own needs to preserve harmony, your brain rewards you with a sense of moral superiority and temporary relief. The conflict is avoided. The tension passes. You feel like you've done the right thing. But beneath that relief, something else is happening. Your nervous system records that your needs are negotiable, that your limits are flexible, that your discomfort is acceptable. And what the nervous system learns, it repeats. This is how suppressed anger is born. Not explosive anger, not dramatic anger, but quiet, delayed anger. The kind that hides behind patience and reason. The kind that whispers instead of shouts. You tell yourself you're fine. You tell yourself you understand. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. But anger doesn't disappear just because you intellectualize it. It waits. It settles into the body. It tightens your chest, your jaw, your stomach. It shows up as fatigue, irritation, cynicism, numbness. You may not even recognize it as anger anymore. It just feels like heaviness. From a psychological standpoint, anger is a boundary emotion. It arises when something you value has been violated. When you suppress it repeatedly, you're not becoming more evolved. You're disconnecting from your internal warning system. Imagine driving a car and taping over the dashboard lights because they're annoying. The car doesn't become healthier. You just lose information. Suppressed anger doesn't make you peaceful. It makes you blind. Philosophically, this is where the idea of strength gets distorted. You start to believe that strength is the ability to endure without complaint. That resilience means tolerance without limit. But endurance without choice is not strength, it's submission. True strength includes discernment. It includes the capacity to say, This stops here. When you never draw that line, you send a message to yourself and to others that your inner world is secondary. And whatever is treated as secondary will eventually deteriorate. This pattern also creates a subtle but profound erosion of self-respect. You may still appear confident. You may still be competent. But internally, there's a quiet awareness that you are not honoring yourself. And self-respect is not built through grand gestures. It's built through thousands of small decisions where you choose alignment over appeasement. When those decisions consistently go against you, confidence becomes hollow. You may still function, but you no longer feel solid. What makes this especially dangerous for empath is that your capacity to understand others becomes the very tool you use to invalidate yourself. You explain away behavior that hurts you. You contextualize disrespect. You empathize with intentions while ignoring impact. You become so skilled at seeing the other side that you forget to stand on your own. And the more you do this, the more resentment quietly accumulates, not just toward others, but toward yourself for allowing it. Delayed anger has another cost. When it finally surfaces, it often comes out sideways: sarcasm, withdrawal, passive aggression, sudden emotional distance, or a sharp outburst that surprises everyone because they're used to you being the calm one. And when that happens, you feel guilt instead of clarity. You apologize for the delivery instead of honoring the message. You promise to do better, meaning quieter, softer, smaller. And the cycle resets. This is not emotional mastery. Emotional mastery does not mean never feeling anger. It means knowing how to use it constructively. Anger, when acknowledged early and expressed cleanly, prevents resentment. It clarifies boundaries. It restores balance. But when anger is delayed, it poisons relationships from the inside. People sense the withdrawal even if they don't understand it. Trust erodes, intimacy weakens, and you are left feeling unseen even though you've been present the entire time. At a deeper philosophical level, chronic self-sacrifice is rooted in a misunderstanding of love. You believe love means absorbing pain so others don't have to feel it. But that is not love. That is martyrdom. Love includes honesty. Love includes limits. Love includes the willingness to disappoint in service of truth. When you deny that, you don't create harmony. You create imbalance. And imbalance always demands correction, one way or another. The shift begins when you stop treating anger as a moral failure and start seeing it as data. Information about where you've overextended, information about what you value, information about what needs to change. This doesn't mean lashing out. It means responding earlier, speaking sooner, setting boundaries before resentment hardens. It means trusting that you can express displeasure without becoming cruel and that others can tolerate your honesty without being destroyed by it. When you allow yourself to honor your anger, something unexpected happens. You become calmer overall, less reactive, less bitter, because anger that is acknowledged doesn't need to scream. It simply informs. And when you respect that signal, your self-respect strengthens. You begin to feel internally congruent again, solid, grounded. Your yes becomes meaningful because your no exists. This is where self-sacrifice transforms into self-leadership. You still care deeply. You still empathize, but you no longer disappear in the process. You stop confusing endurance with virtue and start recognizing that honoring yourself is not selfish. It is stabilizing for you and for everyone around you. Because the truth is simple and uncompromising. Anger ignored becomes resentment. Resentment kills connection. And self-respect lost is far harder to rebuild than any relationship you were trying to save. At some point, every empath reaches a crossroads, whether consciously or not. It's the moment where silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling suffocating, where holding back no longer feels noble, just heavy. This is where the final shift has to happen, because without it, all the awareness, all the emotional intelligence, All the insight you've developed turns against you. And that shift is learning that empathy is not meant to erase you. It's meant to guide you, and guidance without discipline is chaos. For a long time, you believed strength meant staying quiet. You believed maturity meant restraint. You believed that if you could just be understanding enough, patient enough, soft enough, things would resolve themselves. And sometimes they did, but look closer. Many times, what actually happened was that you adapted while others stayed the same, you bent while others remained rigid, you absorbed while others released. That's not balance. That's self-neglect, wearing the mask of virtue. Psychologically, silence feels safer than honesty because it avoids immediate friction. But safety and strength are not the same thing. Silence trades short-term comfort for long-term consequence. Every unspoken truth doesn't disappear. It accumulates. It becomes tension in the body, distance in relationships, doubt in the self. And over time, that silence rewires your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who chooses restraint and start seeing yourself as someone who isn't allowed to speak freely. This is where disciplined empathy enters the conversation. Disciplined empathy is not reactive. It doesn't rush to soothe. It doesn't collapse under guilt. It is grounded, intentional, and clear. It understands that feelings are real, but they are not always directives. Just because someone is uncomfortable does not mean you are wrong. Just because someone is hurt does not mean you caused harm. There is a critical difference between pain that comes from cruelty and pain that comes from truth. Philosophically, this is the difference between being kind and being congruent. Kindness without congruence is fragile. It depends on approval. It depends on being seen a certain way. Congruence, on the other hand, comes from alignment. When your words, actions, and values match, you generate internal stability, and stability is felt by others. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to justify itself. It simply stands. Many empaths fear that if they speak clearly, they will become harsh, cold, or unrecognizable. But clarity does not require cruelty. Boundaries do not require aggression. The absence of discipline is what creates emotional explosions, not its presence. When you express yourself early, cleanly, and without hostility, you prevent resentment from fermenting. You give people a chance to meet you honestly instead of reacting to a version of you that no longer exists. This is also where leadership emerges, whether you intend it to or not. People are drawn to those who are emotionally steady, not those who constantly accommodate, but those who are consistent. When you stop negotiating your truth to manage reactions, your presence changes. Your voice slows. Your posture shifts. You no longer chase understanding, you offer it. And paradoxically, that's when you're understood most. Disciplined empathy also requires letting go of the need to be liked. This is one of the hardest lessons for someone who feels deeply. You spent years attuning yourself to others' needs, so rejection feels personal. But approval is a poor foundation for self-worth. It's unstable. It changes with mood, context, and convenience. When you anchor your sense of self to it, you give away your center. Strength is not the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act in alignment despite it. When you speak honestly, some people will feel uncomfortable. Some may project. Some may resist. That is not failure. That is feedback. It tells you who can grow with you and who relied on you staying small. Not everyone is meant to come with you when you evolve. There's also a deeper liberation here. When you stop over-explaining and start standing firmly, you free others from the illusion that you exist to manage their emotions. You return responsibility where it belongs. People may not like it at first, but they will feel it. And many will respect it, even if they never say it out loud. This doesn't mean you lose compassion. In fact, your compassion becomes more potent. Because it's no longer diluted by self-abandonment. You listen without absorbing. You care without collapsing. You support without sacrificing your spine. That is the difference between empathy as a liability and empathy as authority. Ultimately, disciplined empathy is self-trust in action. It's knowing that you can handle the consequences of truth. It's trusting that your nervous system can tolerate discomfort. It's understanding that your worth is not measured by how little space you take up, but by how fully you inhabit your values. And when you live from that place, something remarkable happens. You stop fearing the impact of your presence. You stop apologizing for your clarity. You stop mistaking silence for peace. You realize that the world doesn't need you quieter. It needs you grounded. Because when empathy is guided by self-respect, honesty becomes an act of strength, boundaries become an act of love, and your voice finally carries the weight it was always meant to.